Well, thank you. Thank you for giving me this wonderful opportunity to talk about the work of the Polish photographer Zofia Rydet. Rydet took up photography after the war, joining the local photographic society in Gliwice, later teaching photography and enjoying early recognition with a series Little Man, which is portraits of children from all over Europe, which was published as a book in 1965. But it was only in 1978, a year which she proclaimed to be her most fruitful, that Rydet began her monumental series, The Sociological Record, frequently hailed as one of the most important works of Polish photography in the 20th century. At the heart of the project was a very simple premise, namely to faithfully show man in his everyday surroundings. Over more than 20 years, Rydet travelled across Poland, taking black and white portraits of people photographed in their homes. The project began while visiting her brother, who lived in the nearby region of Podhala, which was a region in the mountains in the south of Poland. So day after day, Rydet would travel around the local mountain villages taking portraits. This is one of the first portraits she took. The woman on the left was a potter, and her husband was actually very ill and died quite soon after the photograph was taken. In another early work from Podhala, we can see the characteristics of Rydet's record emerging. We see either a couple or a single individual seated with their hands on their laps, looking directly at the camera. Each photograph is taken from a similar point of view, a similar distance is maintained between the camera and the sitter, and the people usually occupy a similar space within the frame. Rydet photographed these individuals against a wall of their home, usually the wall most filled with decoration. The prints are sometimes grainy and the lighting is often harsh. She photographed using a handheld Praktora camera together with a wide-angle lens and a flash. Each image is recorded with a written notation, noting the location the photograph was taken, the year, and sometimes the name of the sitter. Rydet also recorded certain details and motifs that caught her eye, tapestries, for example, which she then developed into subcycles within the record. The title stands in contrast to earlier series by Rydet, which were more evocatively or suggestively titled. The World of Feelings and Imagination, or The Sentimental Ballad, for example. Sociological Record implies a study of human behaviour and also dispatches the viewer to the factual information that can be registered in the photographs. Rydet emphasised this aspect of the record, describing it as, quote, a simple, objective, authentic record of the existing reality taken from a detached perspective. She stated, the greatest value of photography is its role as information, its content, and not the artistic statement, which is transitory. Gradually, the project expanded to include locations further afield. For example, this boy photographed in Gdańsk, which is a city on the Baltic coast in the north of Poland. I really love the way that the lens of his glass reflects the flash and turns him into this kind of one-eyed vision, or suggests one-eyed vision, analogous to this kind of camera that he holds in his hands. The project also extended to include homes in foreign countries, usually when she was opening an exhibition of her work or when she was invited for a commission. She travelled to Germany, Lithuania, Czech Republic, France, and America, here in the home of the Polish collector, Eva Papa. And I think she was visiting, at the time there was an exhibition of Polish photography opening at the ICP. The Polish writer and curator Wojciech Nowicki has described how the record, quote, develops simultaneously in all directions. It carries on devouring new territories. It has tentacles that reach to all sides at the same time. This is Rydet photographed in her own apartment in Gliwice in the 70s. Rydet worked on the record for, across 3 decades and took almost 30,000 photographs, many of which Rydet never had time to print. The sheer size of the record poses a challenge for researchers, how to begin to approach such a monumental body of work. The time frame of the record spans the 1970s to the 1990s, and this is a really turbulent time in Polish history, under communism, with a struggling economy, worker strikes, the rise of the solidarity movement, but also the imposition of martial law in the early 80s, and eventually this transition to a democratic state in 89. Today, I want to contextualise the record in this particular moment of its production, but also suggest certain impulses driving the project that can be understood regardless of the time and place it was produced. So the idea for the record emerged during a visit to a car manufacturing plant, which consisted of small workstations, all identical in shape and size, which each employee had individually decorated with their own choice of imagery. Newspaper cutouts, family photographs, sometimes erotic imagery. But the point that struck Rydet was that no two cubicles were the same. So in the record, Rydet extended this idea to the home, exploring how the personality of the person could be revealed through the objects they choose to surround themselves with. Interiors can suggest their desires, their interests, their investments, sometimes saying more about a person than they would reveal themselves. This is the home of Karol Skarusa, one of the few that are named. His house full to bursting with objects and photographs and ephemera and lots of Americana. There was a whole gallery of portraits of American presidents hanging from one of the ceilings. And Rydet learnt that his family had travelled to America while he had remained behind in Poland. So perhaps on some level this suggests a desire to reconnect with them. So are these portraits of people, or are they portraits of the spaces they inhabit? And for Rydet, the two were really inseparable. A sign painted on the side of this building reads, quote, "Mechanized equipment, modern house." The post-war home in Poland was intended to shape the ideal socialist citizen. The emphasis was on utility, with old-fashioned ornamental furniture or sentimental knickknacks to be forsaken. But even in the most sparsely decorated homes, Rydet's photographs show interiors adorned with precisely the artifacts that were set out to be repressed. So lace, embroidered tapestries, family photographs, religious icons. And these objects don't function purely as decoration, but can also be understood as laden with symbolic value. The Pope, you can see him if I use my little pointer just there, features in many Polish homes in the form of newspaper cutouts, photographs, or sometimes even statues or plaques. Cardinal Karol Wojtyła was elected as Pope in 1978, the same year in which Rydet began the record, and she dedicated a whole subcycle within the record dedicated to recording images of the Pope displayed in people's houses, calling it presence. That this veneration of the Pope did not just possess religious meaning, but was also decidedly political, the church representing the only kind of viable counterpoint or opposition to communism in the 70s and 80s. So potential subversion can also be found within the homes that Rydet photographs. At the centre of this image is a white eagle, the bird which for centuries had been used as a symbol of Poland. Communist authorities had removed the crown from the symbol to suggest the anti-hierarchical, anti-bourgeois, anti-royalist nature of communist ideology. But many Poles construed the removal of the crown to symbolise their lost sovereignty. And Jan Kubik, in his book, The Power of Symbols and Symbols Against Power, noted that when Poles began to protest against communist rule, their banners were adorned with crowned eagles, a sign of defiance against the regime. In Rydet's image, a white crown has been drawn in by hand above the eagle's head. It is within the private space of the home that these views could be acknowledged. This work is from an earlier series of collages by Rydet entitled The World of Feelings and Imagination. The eye actually belonged to her mother, but I think it's a useful image to suggest this idea of constantly being watched. This was a time of surveillance in Poland, particularly under martial law in the 80s, when phones were tapped and all kind of public forms of expression were scrutinized. So the home represented a private space where attitudes could be revealed which might otherwise not be safe to vocalize in public. And yet in photographing these spaces, Rydet opens up these spaces to potential scrutiny by authorities. Even within the sanctuary of the home, there's a sense that these interiors are performed to some extent. I'm going to use my pointer again. In an early image from Podhala, Rydet was amazed to find an image of the Black Madonna, which was a revered icon and one of the most sacred symbols in Poland, sharing the wall with newspaper cutouts here or pictures of political leaders, Edward Gierek, the first secretary of the Polish United Workers' Party, and Brezhnev, the general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And Rydet asked this woman how she could have these men so close to the Holy Madonna. And the woman's response was revealing. I will give you the PG-rated version of her response. She didn't particularly want Gierek in her house, but his presence protected her in case a neighbour or potential informant dropped by. So even within the private space of the home, there's a sense of a facade, these interiors constructed to reveal certain details and suppress others. Rydet certainly found herself at odds with the authorities. Towards the end of the 1970s, the People's Publishing Cooperative intended to publish the record as a book. But every printed text in the 70s had to be approved by the main office for the control for the press, publications, and public performances, with only ideologically correct texts being cleared for publication. The idea to publish the work was abandoned, possibly due to the unfavourable image of Poland that the series revealed. The record does show quite terrible destitution. Adam Mazur, the Polish curator and critic, has described the record as, quote, a brutal panorama of pre-modern Polish provinces, and suggested that you might think these were kind of medieval villages rather than homes in the late 20th century. In the 1970s, Gierek had promised to modernize Poland, attempting industrial and agricultural reform, but these had ultimately ended in political crisis, and also the economic situation severely deteriorated in the 70s, with low wages, overinflated prices, and just a lack of products to sell. Queuing for food became a way of life. This is people queuing in Gliwice outside a dairy shop. And yet state-controlled media would proclaim the success of the party's efforts, a propaganda of success that bared little relation to the reality of life for most Poles. So in this context, the record can be interpreted as a political accusation. Rydet uses her camera to record the poverty of rural villages, intimating that the promised prosperity and improved living standards had failed to transform the lives of Polish citizens. Rydet also seems to betray a nostalgia for a pre-industrial way of life. New technologies had led to the increased obsolescence of traditional craftsmen in villages, and Rydet created a whole subcycle documenting disappearing crafts or disappearing professions in 1980, in which she photographed artisans in their workshops, surrounded by the tools and materials of their trade, recording a form of production that was being superseded by industry. And she collaged these with these handmade signs for each occupation. Interestingly, the artist also is included in this series. This is Jan Śliwka, a painter and sculptor from Gliwice. But changes were happening in Poland during these years. Rydet noted how with tremendous speed, the character of the rural villages she photographed was changing, with whole villages disappearing. She gave the specific example of the village of Maniowy, which was to be destroyed to make way for a new dam. In part, the record is driven by an impulse to preserve a picture of Poland at this time, before these houses, these traditions, this way of life vanished. Speaking about the record, Rydet stated, "It was, or rather still is, supposed to immortalize that which was changing, and which, despite being actual reality, would soon cease to exist, and before long might be difficult to imagine." Much of the record is dedicated to portraits in these small rural areas, but at the same time, Rydet also photographed urban towns and cities, for example, Krakow or Warsaw, documenting the transformation that was taking place here. The houses she photographs are different in character. There's no wooden walls or thatched roofs, but they're rather kind of identical-looking boxes, often sparsely decorated with very tasteful furniture, and wall units made from kind of glossy materials. Interiors also testify to a newfound interest in consumption of mass-produced items, so knickknacks from trinket shops, crystal vases, artificial flowers. She couldn't understand why people would buy artificial flowers rather than just pick fresh ones from the garden. But also televisions and toys begin to appear. Much of this work has only recently become available to researchers. The archive is currently being digitized and made available online. But mostly attention has focused on the kind of rural portraits, but there's much more to the record than this, and some quite surprising finds. The urban photographs seem to be a little more playful in their nature than their rural counterparts. This is a portrait of Jerzy Lewczynski, mimicking this reclining nude hanging above his sofa in his apartment. Lewczynski was actually a key name in post-war Polish photography and featured here at Tate in an exhibition last year, Time Conflict Photography. He was a good friend of Rydet's. They were both members of the same photographic society. And in fact, he accompanied Rydet around, on her journeys around Poland, making the record. And in these urban locations, you get a sense that Rydet allows the sitter more kind of freedom to express their personalities or to perform for the camera. Here's another Polish artist, Leszek Brogowski, masking his identity with this kind of balaclava he's made for himself. When preparing for exhibitions, Rydet arranged photographs into groups of images, so kind of groups of women, groups of children, groups of men, or arranged them according to the region in which they were taken. This method of display allows, this is, by the way, the Disappearing Professions series, the method of display allowed for similarities to be drawn between the interiors, but it also allows for differences to be read between the furnishings and people of different regions. So Rydet noted how in Silesia people were very tidy, in comparison to the hoarders in Podhala, such as Karol Skorusa. City apartments, she said, were kind of very bland and featureless. Here, these kind of couple with very blank faces sat rigidly in this quite austere apartment. And Rydet frequently said how the people in the city had very kind of dull faces compared to the people in the country who were full of character. So she allows for kind of Sander-esque taxonomy in which different parts or segments of society can be ordered into categories and read in relation to the whole. Critics have likened the series to a family, but there's no sense of a traditional hierarchy that you would expect from a family structure. Each person is photographed in the same way, regardless of the social status. Rydet described the people as one human crowd, and certainly the idea of a community does seem to be at play in the record. Using the same format of presentation throughout suggests that a thread of commonality can be drawn between even the most disparate of people. A little context is useful here. After the Second World War, Poland's borders had been redrawn and reincorporated into a new nation. But throughout its history, Europe is being carved up by the surrounding territories. And Poland as a country is marked by a real mix of ethnicities, nationalities, and traditions. But after the war, this heterogeneity was purposely repressed, with Poland promoted as a culturally and ethnically homogenous nation to consolidate this newly reformed state that had been changed beyond all recognition. One policy, for example, was that only Polish was to be spoken rather than regional dialects. Giorgio Agamben in The Coming Community suggests that, quote, what the state cannot tolerate is that singularities form a community without affirming an identity. But this seems to be exactly what Rydet is doing. The idiosyncratic individual is celebrated at the centre of Rydet's photographs, and the record serves as a space in which these individuals can become a community that does not affirm a singular Polish identity, but celebrates multiple identities in all their variety. And the scope of the record, crossing countries and regions, allows this community the potential to extend. Around 1990, Rydet began a new subcycle, and I will allow, if technology permits me, Rydet to explain the project herself.
Bo teraz zaczęłam taką nową serię jeszcze, polegającą na tym, że przyjeżdżam znowu do tych samych domów, w których mam zapisane 10 lat, w których byłam i szukam tych ludzi, których ja robiłam przedtem. Ukazuje się, że w większości domów do tej pory zrobiłam jakieś 15 zdjęć i na tych 15 zdjęć 10 domów nie tylko, że ludzi nie ma, nie tylko ludzie poumierali, ale nie ma domów. To znaczy, jeżeli dom nawet jest, to wszystko jest zupełnie inaczej. Nowi właściciele tych domów zupełnie zmieniają, czyli umiera wszystko. I tylko jedna fotografia może to zatrzymać. Śmierć jest wszędzie. I tylko ja jestem taka silna przez to, że mogę to chwycić i pokazać innym.
Rydet was 67 when she began the record and was intently aware of the passing of time. And this anxiety manifests itself in Rydet's images. On a very literal level, the clocks feature prominently in her photographs. But Rydet also staged juxtapositions between youth and old age in her photographs. Here a couple sit beneath their wedding portrait. They're called monidło, a traditional kind of hand-painted wedding photograph, which is given pride of place in a lot of the homes that Rydet photographs. The couple sit directly beneath the picture of themselves on their wedding day, their faces and bodies made almost unrecognizable by the passing of time. In another image from 1982, a man holds a photograph of himself from his youth, a time now irrevocably past. Both compositions testify to the inevitability of aging, and both frame two distinct moments of time within the space of one photograph. For Rydet, the photograph promised the ability to preserve time. She likened herself to a powerful sorcerer able to stop time, each photograph as a record of frozen reality, carved out of the time at the moment of exposure and preserved within each image for as long as the photograph as object survives. This echoes André Bazin's description of photography as embalming time. In his text, The Ontology of the Photographic Image, Bazin identified a psychological need in man to, quote, preserve artificially his bodily appearance, to snatch it from the flow of time, to stow it away neatly, so to speak, in the hold of life. Bazin used the example of insects in amber. Rydet also seems to make a similar connection here between taxidermy and photography. This stuffed bird and the married couple, both rescued from their proper corruption, artificially kept in the hold of life. Testifying to her motivation for the record, Rydet stated, quote, I have a great sense of satisfaction that I am extending people's lives. This image is taken from another subcycle within the record, Myth of Photography, in which she documents the treasured photographic keepsakes that are kept within the home. The series suggests the photograph can function as fetish, in that it can stand in for your own kind of vanished youth, or as a substitute for bodies otherwise absent or departed. And it also shows how photographs are fetishized by highlighting the importance accorded to the photograph within the space of the home. People surround themselves with photographs and carefully guard these images throughout their lives, testifying to the power the photograph can possess. So stopping time, giving people permanence, making present those now absent, all seem to be tied to an anxiety over her own life, or rather her self-acknowledged fear of death. She said the closer she came to her own death, the more she would like to be able to overcome it. She explored the immutability of her own body in a series of 7 photo collages created in 1982, titled Traces. Rydet montaged photographs of herself alongside family and friends, frozen moments from various stages of her life. The title Traces is particularly pertinent given that Rydet died in 1997, and now we only have these photographs to act as traces, extending and prolonging her own life. The objects surrounding the photographs, lamps, frames, and mirrors, were found and photographed at a flea market in Gdańsk, calling to mind this surrealist fondness for the flea market trouvaille, or found object, as a means to answer subconscious desires. In Compulsive Beauty, Hal Foster discusses the surrealist recovery of cultural detritus from flea markets, suggesting that objects from the past can spark a connection between historical dimensions. The issue of time seems particularly pertinent in one collage where an assortment of clocks loom over images of Rydet in her childhood and old age. The statue in the top left suggests permanence in the act of carving something out of time. And the bottom right corner, there's the frail old woman with her back to us. Time and death seem to haunt the image, and in the top right-hand corner is a clock face that Rydet photographed on the outskirts of Krakow, beneath which is printed the ominous phrase, "One of these hours will be your last." I wanted to end with a quote from Rydet, taken from the opening sequence of a film on Rydet, released in 1990 by the artist Andrzej Rzycki. It begins with Rydet photographing Rzycki, and he asks her how he should sit and pose before the camera. Should I smile? Should I sit up straight? And Rydet responds, instructing him, I want you to sit as though you realize that this is a significant moment, that we are creating something that will outlast us both. I shall be gone, you shall be gone, but the photograph will remain, or so I believe at least. And all over the world, people will be looking at you against this beautiful background. It is very important not to smile and to look straight into the camera. This truly is a significant moment. Thank you.